Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Wow. So now what is the deal with so much phenomena coming out of PA? What's so special over there?
Well, I can't really tell you about why it's special. I mean, historically, there's always been a lot of history about strange things going on, from the Native Americans talking about, Bigfoot encounters, to many newspaper stories from the 1800s up to the present that talk about UFOs and Bigfoot and strange creature encounters in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of history all over the state. We have the Chestnut Ridge, which is a mountain range that runs from Preston County, West Virginia, to Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County in southwest Pennsylvania. It's probably one of the most active areas year after year for Bigfoot activity, UFO sightings, all kind of strange phenomena, which goes on year after year. But so reports have always come around, but don't forget, now I've been taking calls since 1969 from the public. And I also had established one of the only really active places back in those days where somebody could report a sighting too. So, and since that time I've been actively taking calls from the public. So we are one of the few places in the country where if somebody saw something, they at least had a place to report it to, and somebody would investigate the case. But, and again, the reports are just ongoing around here.
And I think that's one of the big problems is, the average person doesn't know who to call when they see something strange like that.
Well, it's a lot different today. Now that you have the Internet, there's a lot of individual groups out there. There's national groups, local groups, a lot of individuals, and a lot of people have numbers for people to call with UFO sightings, but, not everybody really follows up and does the investigation. That's something I've tried to do for years. And during those many years my groups were active, we were out in the field constantly doing on-scene investigations. And we were pretty well covered across the state. So, we were set up that we all did this around our jobs, but we responded 24 hours a day the best we could. In many cases, myself or my investigators were on the scene within minutes to hours after these events occurred. And that's why we could document them so well. And that was so intriguing because in many cases, you got out there and you saw the human reactions, you saw the very unusual animal responses to some of these events, especially with Bigfoot. Quite often, there would be cases, some type of physical evidence at the scene, which we would gather and have laboratories analyze it. And so it was just amazing what we came across all the years that we were doing this. And I can tell you, it'll be 53 years I've been doing this October, and I've never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot. I've interviewed thousands of people. I've seen a lot of evidence, but I've never had my own personal encounter.
Oh, wow. See, now I have had somewhere around 5 UFO sightings myself. The last one was just absolutely incredible. This thing flew over low. I felt like if I had a 40-foot ladder, I probably could have jumped off the ladder and touched it. It was that close. It would look like 4 cigar-shaped objects in formation together, kind of glowing, an orange glow to them. And they had like a white light coming out of the back of them. But now the more we think about it, me and my wife seen them, and the more I think about it, it could have been just one big craft. But it flew right over our house here. Just amazing. But, again, I didn't know who to call, and I just, thankfully my wife got outside and seen it too, so, I didn't look like a nut, but just amazing.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're getting, in the last year or so, we've had quite a number of elliptical objects, like big cigar-type things being reported, and, of course, historically, there's always been a lot of such reports. The cigar-shaped objects, triangular, rectangular objects, discs, sometimes smaller objects coming out of larger ones. And so it is quite intriguing what's going on out there. And I really feel, after all the years I've been doing this, that this whole phenomenon is much more involved and much more complicated than most people have any idea of.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have dealt with all kinds of phenomena, and I'm wondering, out of all the years you've put into it, have you come up with some kind of conclusion as to what's going on? What are
Well, I don't think anybody really knows for sure. And I'm sure as we get into the evening, we talk about some of the really weird cases I've looked into and others that it's much more complicated. When you eliminate all the cases of things that seem to be strange and unusual, and you find out, of course, that many of these are misidentifications or natural man-made objects, there's still that percentage of cases going year after year you cannot easily dismiss. And I'm pretty much convinced that there's probably no one explanation for the unexplained category. I think we're dealing with a number of different things. Could we have some of these could be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Some of the cases we have suggest we're dealing with something that's both physical and non-physical, with UFOs that change physical form and suddenly appear and disappear. And I think it's a lot more complicated than we understand.
So do you feel at all that your electronic background has helped you in this field?
Oh, yeah, in different ways it definitely has. And not only that, but with the people I dealt with. I mean, we had a lot of medical experts. We had former military intelligence people. We had police people involved in police investigations, a lot of scientific people. So over the years, we had a lot of input from a lot of people that had a lot of knowledge. And some of these people had joined me in the field where people came in very skeptical. Pretty much some of these people came in not really believing anything unexplainable was going on. Yet over the years that they stayed out in the field and they began to see the patterns developing, what was going on, they began to realize there was a lot more to the story than any of us understood.
I see. Now, you say that you've had the pleasure and opportunity to go out and investigate some of these scenes. I mean, how much more important is it that rather than just a phone report or somebody who witnesses maybe a version of what happened, how much more important is it to get out there actually on scene and investigate?
Well, I think it's most important because that's the only way we're going to really find out what's going on, is get to the scene, interview the people firsthand, gather any physical evidence, and over a period of time, look at the different patterns and see what we're dealing with. And I think it's most important to, as best we can, try to conduct as many firsthand investigations as possible.
Do you find that most of the reports that come into you, I mean, are we talking about, what kind of people are we talking about? I mean, do most of them come in from just people who, I don't know, maybe have psychedelic kind of past, or do you find a lot of important doctors, things like that, people like that who come forward with this kind of thing?
Are you talking about people who have their own experience and sightings?
Sure, yeah, like the credibility
yeah, I mean,
of people.
I get reports from people from all walks of life, from children to adults, from all kind of backgrounds, from scientific people, police officers, state troopers, farmers, teachers, all kind of people from all walks of life. And even today, the high percentage of people that call in and report these sightings wish no publicity. They wish to remain anonymous. They're out there not to gain anything, but most people are so concerned about what they saw and just trying to figure out an answer, and that's why they're calling in.
I see. Now, have you dealt with crop circle cases as well?
It's very rare in this part of the country. We looked into some back in the 1990s, and over the years we had a few cases, and some turned out to be just a fungus, a few hoaxes, but there were a couple cases back in the early 1990s that were interesting, but very rarely do we get those up here.
Really all it takes is just one case, just like all it takes is one UFO. We could just prove one of them. That's all
correct.
we need. Now, do you think these crop circles, because I believe that some are hoaxes, but I think that there are some that are real. Do you think that these could be a message from somewhere else, or maybe even a message from the Earth?
Well, there's a lot of theories out there, and that's something I really not specialize in that much. I mean, the couple cases that I recall from many years ago around here were on people's private property. There was no access into it. For somebody to perform a hoax on this property, you wouldn't have been able to see it anyhow. And I remember the one case, our investigators were just arriving on the scene, and the farmer was already plowing the area over because he didn't want all kind of people coming all over his property. And there was no indications they were hoaxed whatsoever. But it's interesting. I do think that some things are man-made without any doubt. but some of them appear to be very credible and very, very intriguing, and from so many parts of the world. But unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to really look at too many cases in this part of the country.
Okay, and now, if you would, give us some examples of some of the I guess, most credible cases that you've worked on.
Oh boy, there's been. Well, we can talk about the Kecksburg case, and that's an interesting case. But in a lot of the UFO cases, very intriguing reports. Let me just tell you about probably just some of the things that have happened very recently, and we can go from there and then just go back into history. But a lot of reports, and it's not just UFO sightings. We're getting a lot of very interesting, all kind of very strange creature reports, even other than Bigfoot sightings, and a lot of incidents going on. But here was the case this past April up in Forest County, upper part of Pennsylvania, and this occurred several miles outside of Tioneston around dusk, and the witness was out looking for some of her cats, when she noticed about 50 feet north of the center of the driveway, suddenly the berm of the road started to glow in a circular shape, and she observed a circle of white light that was about 2 feet in circumference. And as she watched, this glowing air became brighter and began to rise off the ground to a height of about 6 feet. The object then formed into a dome shape with what was described as strands of smoke that were swirling inside the lighted circle and appeared to look something like a jellyfish. And the object began to slowly move off towards a nearby field, at which time it began to fade away until it could no longer be seen. About 5 minutes later, a second similar glowing circle object about 30 feet away from where the first one was observed. And that object looked the same as the first one and followed the same pattern over into the field. It got brighter, rose off the ground, and moved towards the field and vanished. And this was followed by a third similar object doing the same actions. The third luminous circle of light appeared in the middle of the road, about 60 feet from the second observation point. In the total time of the three anomalies was about 15 minutes total. No sound was heard. The one witness commented that the one cat ran from the field and wanted to be put inside the house, which was very unusual for that animal. And afterwards, the witness and her husband went to the locations where the objects were seen, but nothing unusual was found on the ground. And another really intriguing case, and I'll tell you a lot about some of these other reports of something similar, because I've worked on many of these cases over the years, but this just happened July 30th up in Columbia County, and this was broad daylight in the afternoon of July 30th, and this was on a major highway. This man was driving down east on Interstate 80 outside of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. It was a nice, clear day. Humidity was low. He had his windows down, and he was moving at a pretty good rate of speed. And as he's driving down the road, he said all of a sudden he had this really uneasy feeling as if something was wrong with his vehicle or that some type of accident was about to occur. And he's tuning on his radio. He's hitting the auto seek button, just trying to get a radio station. And a short time later, as he's driving down the road, his passenger side window was open as well. And suddenly, a white, translucent, solid, round object about the diameter of a softball appeared outside of the passenger side window. But the object was not luminous. And as he watched this sphere, that he said may have been a little more oval than spherical in shape, paced the vehicle as it was moving down the road, and then it floated into the vehicle through the open window. And as he watched, the object dropped down to the floorboard. It moved around towards the driver along the floor, and he said he could see through the sphere, and that the surface appeared to be crisscrossed and divided by a line about 1/4 inch wide. And he said it looked similar to a vein that was darker than the object and somewhat of a gray color. And as he watched, he became more concerned, and he said this thing began to move very slowly along the floor, and it proceeded up the hump in the middle of the floorboard, continued to move towards the driver's feet. When it reached his right foot, it suddenly stopped, reversed direction till it became centered on the hump. Then the object left the truck by passing through the seat, the back of the cab, and out the bed of the moving vehicle. He said the entire event lasted about 30 to 45 seconds, and he said that this thing just moved very nonchalant, seemed as though it came in to look around and didn't care that anybody was seeing it, and he said that odd feeling he had went away as soon as the object left the vehicle. And very interesting report.
That is interesting. That's amazing. And, you know, I know that there's people out there who think, oh, this can't be, because they haven't had those experiences. And I envy you for, you know, not being one of those people just because you haven't seen it. You don't believe it. You know, for me, I'm glad I had the experiences I've had, because it's really opened me up to all this. I know it's real. And that just goes with everything from UFOs to ghosts. Now, Bigfoot, that's another story. I'm not so sure there, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We have to take a break here, Stan, so let's do that. And when we come back, I'd like to discuss about, I guess it was between 73 and 74, was it, that you had huge reporting? I'd like to hear a little bit about that. Okay, we'll talk about that when we come back. My guest is Stan Gordon, and we have him linked up over on LateNightInTheMidlands.com. So go on over, click on his link. Everything you need to know is right there once you click that link. I'm Michael Vera. This is Late Night in the Midlands on the LNM Radio Network. The call-in number is 347-989-1012. I'm Michael Vera. My guest, Stan Gordon, and we're talking about UFOs and mysterious creatures. And so it should get interesting, and we'll take your calls. If you got questions or comments very shortly, we will take those calls. Feel free to call in at 347-989-1012. You just got to press 1 so we know you want to get on the air. You can also call in using Skype by going to the Radio N Search, the Blog Talk Radio LNM page. Yeah, the link is up on LateNightInTheMidlands.com. I'm so used to saying it, I knew it was going to slip one of these times. Oh, there it is. But, yeah, it's the LNM Radio Network on Blog Talk Radio. And, again, the link is up on LateNightInTheMidlands.com. So the best way to do it is just jot down over on LateNightInTheMidlands.com to the chat room if you need further directions. And Autumn or Anthony or Thomas or one of the great people in our chat will direct you on how to do that. But, you know, it's funner to listen on LateNightInTheMidlands.com and join everybody in the chat, because we have intelligent conversations where people are allowed to express their opinions, good or bad, you know, whether they agree or disagree. We don't attack for that. Not us, not me. So we're going to get back to it, and we welcome you to become a member of LateNightInTheMidlands.com. And Stan, we are back, my friend. And so, yeah, why was 73 and 74? I mean, that was a big year in that time for reportings?
Well, back in 1973 and about the fall, that was the last really major UFO wave that occurred across the state, across the United States. It was a major time for UFO activity, and it was making all the headlines in newspapers, the evening news for weeks and weeks across the country at that time. But back here in Pennsylvania, it actually started the first day of the year in 1973, and it continued to the last day of the year. We had hundreds of UFO sightings being reported pretty much on a continuous basis, which is the focus in the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot casebook. And there was just a tremendous amount of UFO activity going on, and many of these reports weren't lights in the sky, but many of these were low-level sightings, objects chasing cars, objects hovering low over vehicles and low over the highways, UFO landings, just all kind of really interesting cases we investigated. And the UFO sightings, the phenomena alone was just really intriguing what was going on, but it got much more exciting as we got into the summer of that year, because at that time we had the biggest outbreak of Bigfoot sightings in history that occurred throughout western Pennsylvania. It started with a phone call that I received, only actually not far from where I live, several miles away outside of Greensburg in a rural area, and I got a call from a person who was a relative of the person who had this incident occur. And they told me that this fellow had been taken to the hospital. He had just gotten out. The hospital was back home the day I got the call, and they told me that something very unusual had happened to him and that I really should go out and talk to this guy. So what I found out was, now I got the call on August the 7th of 73. This happened on July 31st. And but it happened was it was a warm evening out in the rural area, and this fellow was shaving, as he always did in the evening, because he always got up really early in the morning to go to work. So he was shaving and began to smell this odd odor. And he said it smelled something like rotten cucumber. And he turned around and, for whatever reason, looked at the bathroom window, and here's these two large glowing red eyes staring at him. But the window's over 8 feet off the ground. And he ran into the other room, started yelling for some of the other family members, and they ran in the room, and they could smell the odor, but whatever was in the window had now left the area. And they thought it was unusual because they did have some dogs outside, and the dogs weren't barking, and they generally bark at anybody. Well, anyhow, the guy had some health problems. He was taken to the hospital the next day, and he went to the hospital, and I went out to interview him that day on August the 7th. So I went out to interview him and was looking around his house and talking to other people there, and I had found out that a number of the local boys had several weeks before were taking a shortcut over to the local mall, which was there back at that time, and there was a lot of woods and brush around there. And as they're taking their walk over, they hear some noise in the brush, and they thought it was a deer, so they started throwing some rocks in to scare the deer out. And to their surprise, instead of a deer coming out, here's this very large, hairy, hair-covered creature with long arms walking upright with a long stride across the road and up the field, out through the field, and up the hill behind this home. So I asked permission to go up and look around that property, and several of the kids said, "Couldn't we go with you?" And I said, "Yeah, come on." So we walked up there, and we were up there for a while, and we're looking around up in that hill up there, and the ground conditions were not really that good, especially like for tracks. And we continued to look around, and I was about ready to head back, and I happened to look down to see the strangest footprint I had ever seen. And the kids came over, and they were just like in awe. I couldn't believe what kind of an animal could make this track. Well, the track was 13 inches long and 8 inches wide, but it was three-toed. And it was really clearly defined. I mean, the toes were very, very deep, very clearly defined. In fact, there's a picture of it in my book. And I got on the radio, called one of my assistants, and he came out, and we took photographs and measurements of it, and then we made a cast of that footprint. But anyhow, while we're out there in the field, we get a radio call that one of our investigators north of Pittsburgh, this would be close to the Ohio line, had that morning been investigating an incident where something 9 foot tall had looked in a window up there, and the police had found these large footprints near that residence up there. So this started this massive wave of Bigfoot activity. And, historically, you'll hear about a Bigfoot sighting in a little community, and, they have one sighting and that's it. Well, that's not what happened here. This started in this one particular area, but reports began to come in from all over southwestern Pennsylvania and then other parts of the state and down in the eastern part of the state as well. And many cases where there were multiple reports sometimes on the same day, many from widely separated areas. A lot of these were daylight reports where people were extremely close range. And when I say extremely close, I mean people were 5 to 10 feet away in some cases from these creatures, like moving in cars and whatever. And sometimes there were multiple creatures involved, not just one, but more than one. In a lot of the cases, we get out to the scene, and there would be some type of physical evidence there, such as trails of footprints or other indication of something where a great amount of strength was used that you could tell. The animal reactions were amazing. I mean, I interviewed different police officers and state troopers who responded to some of these incidents as well. And they were just amazed at what they saw in how the animals responded, because humans can be fooled, but the animals can't. And a lot of these Bigfoot cases in particular, especially with the dogs, even though this showed up in other domestic and farm animals as well, but especially with dogs, when these creatures were in a distance, the dogs would just bark and carry on dramatically. But when they got very close range to these creatures, the most vicious dogs, they wouldn't bark, they would shake, they would shudder, they would move, they would hide in their pens or hide wherever they could. And sometimes they wouldn't even eat right for a day or 2 or 3 days later. and that was something that could not have been fabricated. And those reports went on, as I said, into 1974. It wasn't as active as 73, but the reports were continuing over a widespread area. And, I started looking into Bigfoot activity back in the late 1960s. I remember when I was in high school, and the kids all knew I was already interested in these subjects, and people would begin to come to me with reports. And I remember in high school, some of the kids would tell me about going out with their dates to this one cemetery out along the base of the Chestnut Ridge, which always had a lot of history of odd things going on. But these kids would come back and tell me stories of seeing gorillas coming out of the woods and throwing rocks at their car. And that was an area that historically and ever since then has been a hot area for Bigfoot activity. There's always been a lot of history of Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, going back to the Native Americans and reports in the 1800s and up to the present in newspapers throughout the state. And again, I mentioned to you about the Chestnut Ridge being one of the most active area along that mountain range from Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County and southwest Pennsylvania. And back during this wave of 73 and 74, those areas were extremely active with these reports. But the point is, when I got involved initially with the Bigfoot reports, I was open-minded to the possibility that if these are authentic and these are real reports, and these seem to be, I talked to a lot of really credible people who had seen these things, that we appear to be dealing with some type of unknown primate. Well, that's what I had always considered, and I still keep an open mind because I don't have the answer to what's going on. However, as this wave is beginning to intensify in 73 and the 74, and the reports are continuing to come in, some very, very odd things began to come to our attention. One of the things that began to come to our attention was the fact that we had very well documented cases where UFOs and Bigfoot were seen together at the same time and place. Mm-hmm. And we began to question, like, what are we dealing with here? What's going on? One of the earliest reports was September 27th, up towards outside of Pittsburgh, almost to the Ohio line, where two young ladies were waiting for a friend to pick them up out in the country, and they observed this very tall, hairy creature with white hair coming across the road, running towards the woods. And it was strange enough to see this 7 to 8 foot tall, hairy creature running, but in one of its hands, it had a small, luminous sphere of light, a glowing sphere. And this thing ran into the woods. So they ran in, told the one girl's father on the property. He went down in the woods. While he's down there, this object comes across the sky and projects a beam of light down into the woods. And so that was very, very fascinating. But these reports continued to occur, and I can tell you about some other really fascinating cases that we investigated. But as the reports kept coming in, and you got to remember, a lot of these were people very frightened, having no idea what they were dealing with. Most of these people were people that never would have believed these things could exist. And a lot of these people were calling the police departments to report what was going on, and then we were getting the calls to investigate the cases. And it just brought to our attention that there was a heck of a lot more going on here than we had any idea of. And it really gave us a whole different perspective on UFO phenomena and particularly the Bigfoot phenomena.
It's funny you say that because, I've had a few Bigfoot investigators who have been on this show, and I brought that up to them. And I wondered, I said, if this creature is real, if it's a real phenomena, and they seem to just disappear like no tomorrow, maybe they're getting beamed up.
Well, I don't know so much about getting beamed up, but there was a lot of things we uncovered that really indicated that we may not be dealing with a normal flesh and blood animal. I've always questioned over all the years of the hundreds of Bigfoot sightings I've investigated in Pennsylvania, and reports are coming in, even recent weeks, and year after year people were seeing these things, and a lot of really credible people who have no reason to make up these stories, people not looking for any publicity. But I have to question, if there's so many sightings, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country and many other parts of the world of something similar being seen, just like the skeptics ask, well, if these things are really being seen, why don't we have a body? or more physical evidence? And I've got to ask the same question. It just doesn't make any sense. After all of these years, over so many encounters, by now there should be a body. Because no matter how rare a specimen of animal is, we have the skeletal remains, even though you may rarely see these things. But with Bigfoot, that's just not the case. And we had cases that were just dramatically bizarre, which may well be and which give us clues as to why we probably don't have any bodies. And we can get into some of those cases as well.
Blog Talk Radio, where millions of hosts and listeners gather. Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Wow. So now what is the deal with so much phenomena coming out of PA? What's so special over there?
Well, I can't really tell you about why it's special. I mean, historically, there's always been a lot of history about strange things going on, from the Native Americans talking about, Bigfoot encounters to many newspaper stories from the 1800s up to the present that talk about UFOs and Bigfoot and strange creature encounters in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of history all over the state. We have the Chestnut Ridge, which is a mountain range that runs from Preston County, West Virginia, to Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County in southwest Pennsylvania. It's probably...
this thing flew over low. I felt like if I had a 40-foot ladder, I probably could have jumped off the ladder and touched it. It was that close. It would look like 4 cigar-shaped objects in formation together, kind of glowing, an orange glow to them. And they had like a white light coming out of the back of them. But now the more we think about it, me and my wife seen them, and the more I think about it, it could have been just one big craft. But it flew right over our house here. Just amazing. But, again, I didn't know who to call, and I just, thankfully my wife got outside and seen it too, so, I didn't look like a nut, but just amazing.
Oh, yeah, really one of the most active areas year after year for Bigfoot activity, UFO sightings, all kind of strange phenomena, which goes on year after year. But so reports have always come around, but don't forget, now I've been taking calls since 1969 from the public, and I also had established one of the only really active places back in those days where somebody could report a sighting too. So, and since that time I've been actively taking calls from the public. So we are one of the few places in the country where if somebody saw something, they at least had a place to report it to, and somebody would investigate the case. But and again, the reports are just ongoing around here.
And I think that's one of the big problems is, the average person doesn't know who to call when they see something strange like that.
Well, it's a lot different today. Now that you have the Internet, there's a lot of individual groups out there. There's national groups, local groups, a lot of individuals, and a lot of people have numbers for people to call with UFO sightings, but not everybody really follows up and does the investigation. That's something I've tried to do for years, and during those many years my groups were active, we were out in the field constantly doing on-scene investigations, and we were pretty well covered across the state. So, we were set up that we all did this around our jobs, but we responded 24 hours a day the best we could. In many cases, myself or my investigators were on the scene within minutes to hours after these events occurred. And that's why we could document them so well. And that was so intriguing because in many cases, you got out there and you saw the human reactions. You saw the very unusual animal responses to some of these events, especially with Bigfoot. Quite often, there would be cases, some types of physical evidence at the scene, which we would gather and have laboratories analyze it. And so it was just amazing what we came across all the years that we were doing this. And I can tell you, it'll be 53 years I've been doing this October, and I've never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot. I've interviewed thousands of people. I've seen a lot of evidence, but I've never had my own personal encounter.
Oh, wow. See, now I have had somewhere around 5 UFO sightings myself. The last one was just absolutely incredible.